Okay, tonight we are going into Marx. Again, this is a very fast-paced class. We have 1 hour classes for like 15 sessions. And so you only get 1 hour of Marx, only 50 minutes of Marx. And the reality is you could spend semesters studying Marx. Marx was obviously an economist. He was the last of what we will call the classical economists. But he was much more. He was a sociologist, historian. He was a multidisciplinary kind of guy. And much of socialism, you cannot ascribe all of socialist thought to Karl Marx, but he is kind of that foundational thing, or the glue that kind of threads throughout many facets of socialism. So we have to wrestle with him a little bit. And emblematic of Marx is kind of his quote that you see here on the screen. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. I mean, he had a very activist agenda in his mind, and that's what we'll see today, is we'll learn a little bit about Karl Marx, what he recommended, how his system of thought led to various economic theories, and where they might have raised some legitimate issues, as well as where they may have went awry. So here's kind of a roadmap what we're going to do tonight. So I won't read all of it to you, but we're going to just do a little bit of review from last time real quick. And then we're going to give you a little bit of background on how Marx fit into economic system overall, who he was. It's really interesting to learn a little bit about his personality. If you have some time, sometime you can maybe check it out more. It's actually pretty sad in terms of his life. And then we can get into his major works. We'll get into Communist Manifesto just briefly, as well as Das Kapital, his treatise on economics. And then we're going to look and see what went wrong in Marxian economics. So last time, just as a review, just to get us on back where we were, because that was 2 weeks ago, we kind of took a look, wanted to be in a common framework for how we think about economic systems. Because we talked last time that definitions really matter, and we saw that definitions were treated differently by different people, what they meant by something. So the way we kept these systems, where we had capitalism, fascism, socialism, and communism, kind of put this matrix together against who owned the consumer's goods and who owned the producer's goods, or means of production. And so you could see the matrix we came up with and talked about, with capitalism having private ownership of both the consumer's goods as well as producer's goods. Ostensibly, fascism had the same kind of setup, except we kind of talked about how in fascism, or National Socialism, we found that the means of production, the capital goods, while ostensibly owned by the private party, were under the direction of the state for state purposes. So in that case, it's more like the capital goods or the means of production are not owned by entrepreneurs, but by managers working for the state. That's kind of a better way to think about fascism. Socialism, we go to have full public ownership of the means of production, while we still have private ownership of consumers' goods. And with communism, we said that the goods for means of production were owned by the public, as well as the consumer goods, although they're distributed to people publicly, but then they get to be obviously consumed privately. So that was kind of our framework to understand. And we said you could even look at maybe 3 types of socialism to think, because there were so many definitions, with historical socialism being, as we said, with the ownership of the means of production being held by the social entity, the government. We said that there's a soft socialism, and in parentheses I have fascism for a reason, because we wanted to point out economically, fascism isn't necessarily Nazism, right? Or so it has that bad label, because you can have fascism without all the nastiness. In other words, you can still have, as we have in many cases across the globe today, we have some soft form of fascism, i.e. the state, the government is going to be exercising control of at least parts of the economy, or maybe just providing incentives or regulations. So that's a softer form of fascism. And then the final category was really more a social welfarism, social democracy. But this isn't really, at an economic level, it's not really concerned with how we run the economy, because in many cases that's just talking about income redistribution or a large safety net. And in many cases, as we talked last time, such as the Nordic countries, you might find many aspects of their economy actually freer than parts of our economy, but they have maybe a more expansive safety net. So those are different ways that people talk about socialism in the world today, and that's kind of the framework we had last time. So, with that, you're now into lesson 2. And Karl Marx was a classical economist. So, I want to walk you through, since there were no prereqs for this class, so many of you may not have even have had economics. You may not understand this term, classical economics. What was that about? So let's take a little bit of time to walk through it. I hope all of you have heard of Adam Smith and his book, The Wealth of Nations. In it, he was kind of the first systematic economist. And Smith was really concerned about growth and how, as the title to his book says, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, Smith was really concerned with how did all this positive growth in the economy emerge when we'd been living at subsistence level and very low productivity level for millennia almost. So that was the question he was asking. But Smith was a classical economist, that first systematizer, because he tried to understand this nature of value. Why is it that there's this disagreement between what he called value in exchange and value in use? Those weren't, so something like water is eminently valuable in use, and yet in exchange it would be very low valued. And he had a problem, because how do you explain why a diamond, which has such a low value in use, yet has so much value in exchange? At the end of the day, he struggled with that, and the classical economists tried to put their theory of value based on a cost of production theory, a labor theory of value, we would say. So the amount of labor that went into production of a good was what gave it its economic character and its value. So for Smith, he would say if it takes a man 2 days to catch a beaver as a deer, or he could go the other way. If it takes you twice the amount of time to catch a beaver as it does a deer, then a deer to beaver ought to have an exchange ratio of 2 to 1. Kind of that, because it was the labor that goes into it, assuming that it's equally beneficial or equally fun to catch a beaver as a deer. But that's the starting point of the classical economists. From there, we had other giants. There are many others, but David Ricardo was next up on the list. And he was really the classical economist that I would assert that Marx would call his mentor. He also had a labor theory of value. Ricardo had many important things for economics. Most important, his theory of comparative advantage. But he focused on distribution, on these questions of value. It started going down the path of how do we decide of the value in exchange, how much goes to the worker, how much goes to the capitalist, how much goes to the landlord for this profit, interest, and wages. What's the split? What's the basis and nature of it? And so Ricardo took away the Smithian focus on growth to distribution, and when he did, he even came up with what he called his fundamental theorem of distribution. And that he said that basically the wages are going to be in conflict with profits. To have higher wages means you necessarily must have lower profits, and to have higher profits, you must necessarily have lower wages. That leads to this creation of some sort of conflict between profits and wages, and now you have these kind of class kind of antagonisms that come out of a Ricardian view. There were other classical economists in the mix, but the next big economist would be John Stuart Mill. The two of their textbooks, The Principles of Political Economy, really spanned about 60 years of generation, ultimately almost until Marshall's Principles came out in 1890. So these two would have been the dominant thinkers of economics. Mill took it even further. He defended free enterprise, but he insisted he himself was a socialist. He loved socialism. He thought that was the way to go. And he said something more problematic, as we see here. He says the distribution of wealth is a matter of human institution only. It's a matter of caprice, in other words, that you get what you get in an exchange, in a production process, and you get what you get. So it's really could be arbitrarily reassigned. In other words, maybe we don't need so much going to profits. Maybe more should go to wages and labor, or vice versa. So Hayek later on said that he believes that Mill himself was kind of that force which led intellectuals to embrace socialism. And Mill identified socialism. Again, he said he was a socialist. 3 kinds. This utopian socialism, he said, really just a way of kind of communitarian living. That would be a voluntary socialism. You probably are familiar with some communes that are out there today in various parts of the country and various parts of the world. They still exist. Sometimes they last shorter, sometimes they last longer. But that's kind of a different kind of characteristic. The second kind of socialism he identifies as revolutionary socialism. That would be akin to what Marx is going to be putting out there, the idea of seizing power by force and to nationalize industry. The last category would be fascist socialism, which is, again, is that more government involvement in the economy, regulatory kinds of things, as well as control of the means of production. And so Mill didn't think that private property necessarily needed to be privately owned, and thought that it was, in many cases, unjust when that was created. So that led to the pathway for Marx to come on board as really the last classical economist. And again, to remind you what I just said, as a classical economist, Marx is going to pick up and continue with this theme of distribution being the central issue, and how we decide on the portion of economic output, who gets what, as well as he's going to ground his system in the labor theory of value. Those two aspects were the things that Marx carried over from the classical system. And interestingly, Mill's book came out in 1848, and that's when Marx is going to be coming up with his Communist Manifesto. So who is this guy, Marx? Well, he starts out, he's the son of a former Jewish banker, because his father became a Lutheran when it became more beneficial to business. He was going to be forced to give up many of his business kind of activities if he stayed Jewish. He became a Lutheran, such that Karl was raised as a Christian. I don't know at what level, but that was his upbringing. And so you can even see this in his writings, that influence. It's almost as if this Edenic paradise, utopian view that Marx often had, was coupled with almost the other bookend of the Bible, this apocalyptic vision in the conflict, the class conflicts. It's almost as that seeped into Marx's thinking. But unfortunately, later on, Marx is going to be influenced by two philosophers. Very importantly, Feuerbach, in his Essence of Christianity, argued against God, and Marx embraced that. Basically, Feuerbach suggested that God did not create man. Actually, man created God. In our need for what we thought should be the perfections of the world, we would have this envisioning of God. And the second major philosopher that influenced Marx was Hegel. Hegel has got this theory of dialectics. We'll expand on that in a moment. But that would be the foundational part of Marx's theory of dialectical materialism. And in this kind of model, for Marx, these tensions, we'll expand on in a moment, but these tensions are going to be the force which leads to one economic system to another. That's where Marx is going to go with this. So who was this guy again? Well, we would say in today's terms, he was a party animal when he was young. He was getting drunk and disorderly. He was carousing. He was fighting. He was wounded in a duel. He's arrested for being armed, and he's put in jail. All these kinds of things as a young man. The reports he was a significant intellectual, constantly reading, and yet he was also constantly partying and living the life of a bohemian. As his father would say, he castigated him as a slovenly barbarian, an antisocial person, a wretched son, an indifferent brother, a selfish lover, an irresponsible student, and a reckless spendthrift. And many of those charges are no doubt true, especially the last one, the reckless spendthrift, as we'll talk about. So Marx had went to several universities. He was at the University of Berlin when he was doing his PhD work, had completed all of his coursework, and then became upset because the administration there was changed out, and he thought they were anti-Hegelians that would not allow his dissertation to be accepted. So he sent his dissertation to the University of Jena, and it was accepted without any change. Now, that university had a reputation of being a little bit of a diploma mill, even at the time. Nevertheless, you should not assume that he was not a significant intellectual scholar just because of that. His work is recognized as being genuinely impressive, even if many aspects of it might be wrong. He passed his dissertation, and it was shortly thereafter that he headed down to Paris. Paris, with his new wife, Jenny, His wife Jenny was the daughter of a baron and baroness, and that wealth was significant to help sustain him for a time. But unfortunately, his wealth, his own parents and her own parents' wealth was not sufficient to sustain their standard of living, which was often extravagant, even in the amount of when they were very desperately poor. But down in Paris, he meets Friedrich Engels, and that's going to be his intellectual partner for the rest of his life. And they would write the Communist Manifesto together. And Engels would also be the financial subsidizer of Marx later on in his life. Both of them were supported by their parents. Engels likewise had a wealthy father that owned a couple of factories who gave him access to a position, and then he was able to make money. So the final bullet we see here, he would have financial mismanagement his whole life. And it just is a really sad illustration of this. Several of his children died, maybe not directly from malnutrition and the squalor, but the unhealthy living arrangements that they had were constant. And that led to health problems for the whole family. Just a tremendous trial. But Marx relayed to Engels one time, financial situation has gotten so severe, we're limited to desperate situations. I might have to let go the maids. And you think about that. Wow, they're in such desperate straits, and they're still having maids. Why would you do that? Perhaps because his wife had been the daughter of a baron and baroness, and who knows? They'd been raised in a higher standard of living, but they could not accept that they did not have much means. And furthermore, Marx himself never really held a steady job. He had periods of time where he'd have some employment for newspapers and printing offices and things like that, but those were very infrequent. He was almost always living off his parents, her parents, or Engels, and not living very well. In fact, desperately poor when he moved to London. And he was arrested, we see here, in Belgium after he spent his inheritance. This is part of the problem. Spending his inheritance to arm Belgians with rifles so that they could lead to revolutionary communism. That wasn't perhaps the wisest use of his money. So that's some background into Marx. Now we're up to, okay, what were his ideas? Well, you can see them here. I'll let you read those. It's quite long, but I wanted you to get a flavor. Obviously, the Communist Manifesto is online, but I just picked out a few of the parts of it that kind of give you a flavor of what he's out. Notice some of the terms he uses, the harshness, the rhetoric. He and Engels wrote this when they were like 30, 32, that kind of time frame. So they were still fairly young. They had the zeal of revolutionary youth, and you see it in the words. We say, back down in the third bullet, is resolved personal worth and exchange value, and in place of the numberless indefensible charter freedoms, has set up that single unconscionable freedom, free trade. He didn't like free trade. In one word, for exploitation, veiled by religious and political illusions, it has substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. Brutal exploitation for you to give someone else a job and pay them money. But his terms are all in the harshest of terms. It's this rhetoric that he adds to this. And we'll see why in some of the ways he thinks about it in just a moment. So the last one, the theory of the communists, may be summed up in the single sentence: abolition of private property. Here's the platform. Take a scan through this platform that they had in the Communist Manifesto. You'll see some of the things that you'll probably be happy that they were endorsing, and some of them are good and implemented today. Other things are part of our system today and part of our political process. You can't, in other words, we can't escape Marx. Even if his economics doesn't work, and I'm going to explain why today and then the next time when we see Mises' critique. But even if his economics doesn't work, the ideas and the power of Marx lives on. It's with us. It's going to be guiding a lot of our discussion. So we see a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. Where is that really? In most of the industrialized countries, you're going to have something like that. Abolition of all rights of inheritance. We don't have abolition of inheritance, but we have somewhat high inheritance tax. It varies from time to time what they do, but it's certainly circumscribed. And you can see other things, some things you might like. Hey, free education for children in public schools, abolition of child labor. So some people would think that's a good thing. And that's part of his manifesto as well. Okay, so he did that in 1848, and that then led him into, he had to head over to England. He and Engels would live in England the rest of their lives. And that led to his economic theory and development. And this is the period where he's actually going to be his most impoverished financially. But this is where most of his work would happen. He would go for days doing nothing, and then he would go literally days on end without even sleeping to do his writing. He was a very intense person. He was so intense when you'd see people in arguments, he would come up to somebody and had this beard, and some of the young ladies have his picture of him on their shirts over here. The bearded guy, yes, over here. So you can look up and see a picture of Marx online. He would go up to someone and say, "I will annihilate you." Can you imagine that? Just, "I will annihilate you." Pretty intense guy. You might say, "This is a scary dude. I think I want to get away from him." So this is kind of Marx, a very intense man, very passionate about his ideas. So what is his theory all about? Well, we're going to walk through it in several charts. The dialectical process is kind of instrumental to him. It's this idea that there's these inner tensions, these inner conflicts that are constantly fighting and leading to something that's going to lead to a metamorphosis, a transformation to something else. And so when Marx looks at the world, he sees this world as this dialectical process where we're seeing this transformation. It's not just things are getting a lot better quantitatively or not just quantitative growth, there's a qualitative transformation. The actual essence of something is transforming as the economy or whatever the dialectical system is. In Marx's case, the economy is becoming something new, such that capitalism was something entirely different than was feudalism. It's a different system, qualitatively, not just quantitatively in terms of output. Okay? And he'll use these terms of this distinction between what he calls the inner essence and the outward appearance. He says, vulgar economists deal with appearances only. And that would be someone like me. I would be one of his vulgar economists. And he just meant common economists, people of no economic training in his mind. Remember, he has quite an elevated perspective of himself. Such that someone like me that would look at, say, GDP growth, or look at unemployment, or look at kind of, if we do this income tax change, it might lead to this change in economic behavior. He would say that you're only looking at the appearance of what's going on. You're not getting to the essence of what's going on. And so that's kind of his thing. So rather than looking at cause, leading, effect, and economists are typically trying to identify cause and effect, that cause, he says, no, that's not really what's going on here. His conception has this dialectic process of constant interaction of causes and effects kind of rotating. It's much more complex than what he would say the superficial explanation that I might give. So he says that appearance gives explains a given state of being, but the essence of it is going to be the intrinsic pattern of potentialities for change. If you look deep, you can start to see what the economy could really be doing. You've got to go to a deeper level for Marx. And so Thomas Sowell, quote here, he says, the dialectical approach rejects uncritical acceptance of existing empirical appearances and seeks instead the inner pattern from which these appearances derive and evolve. So that's kind of the Marxian methodology up front. So he also notes that because of this process, there are no such things as universal economic laws. There are economic laws that are going to be consistent with a given method of production. Capitalism will have its economic laws. Capitalism will have its way of relating to things. But as this process goes, it's going to transform, and there are going to be new laws for the new thing that comes on when socialism comes along. Likewise, feudalism had its own economic laws. Do not think that Marx was not impressed, however, by capitalism. He was. He continually lauded capitalism for its amazing powers of productivity, how much capitalism was able to produce. But he said that very power of capitalism would lead to its demise. In the dialectical process, capitalism is going to lead to so much productivity, it's going to lead to a transformation that is going to necessarily, it's a historical necessity, lead to socialism. And so he's going to see it's going to pave the way for this. He wants to bring, as we talked about a little bit last time, he wants to have a conscious central planning to the economy to control this anarchic production that he sees in capitalism. And I would assert to you that that's still the primary economic goal. To the extent you hear people talk about socialism from an economic perspective, not just kind of a redistribution, that's still a goal, to control the anarchy of production, to have a more rational order that we would have. And when you hear that, that's Marxism. One of the things that Marx does well, unlike some of his critics, even unlike some of his neoclassical critics, and we'll hit this more in the subsequent lessons when we get to this, but he understands capitalism. He understands the market process, this competition, right? And the rivalrous process within the market economy, the market process, is not a world that we talk about in economic classes of perfect competition where you live in equilibrium always. He knows that's not the market. The market is one of disequilibrium. And it's precisely that disequilibrium and that competition for resources which means you're going to get wasted resources. And you're going to have all this anarchy. You know, why should Ford create a new pickup truck and GM create a new pickup truck when one could just do it and we could free up those resources and have those used for something else? So, but he understands there's going to be competition to see who can serve the customer best. And he lauds capitalism for its ability. But in his mind, we can do a lot better. Right? So the quote on the bottom of the screen, if you see it there, kind of captures this essence the best for Marx. What distinguishes the worst architect from the best of bees is this, that the architect raises his structure in imagination before he erects it in reality. Right? So Marx has this idea of the architect being the central planner. I'm going to imagine the structure. I'm going to see the plan. These bees are representing millions of workers, millions of consumers, all unorganized. There's an order that comes out of what bees do, and Marx recognized there's an orderliness to the market. It leads to higher and higher production. He gets it. He says, wow, the architect can see the plan before. It's of that nature. The central planning is of that higher level than even the bees. That's the analogy that he would use. Okay, at this point now, we're going to get to Marx's Das Kapital. We're going to look a little bit about his economics broadly, how this plays into effects. He thought very highly of Das Kapital, thought that the working class are actually going to read this tome. That was not to be. It was a very difficult book that almost everybody panned. Interestingly enough, if it wouldn't have been for Engels' money, it probably would have ended right there. But Engels did pay for its translation specifically into Russia, which had a tremendous impact because it was picked up by Russian intellectuals, particularly Vladimir Lenin. Lenin would be the one that would really push socialism and Marxian views in Russia throughout. So the quote there, without Marx, there would have been no Lenin. Without Lenin, there would have been no communist Russia. So profound effect, even though while in his life, Das Kapital had almost no impact, right? But it had impact in the long run because of this. Marx wasn't able to do any major works after this. Primarily, he had a lot of physical health problems. Again, perhaps because of the squalor that they lived in. He didn't exercise well. He didn't eat well. He drank very heavily. All those things led to him being very unable to produce much. He also got involved in other intellectual pursuits. Engels wasn't aware that he was teaching himself Russian because he wanted to understand more about the Russian experience. Meanwhile, he's published Das Kapital, and in Das Kapital he said, I'm going to explain these issues more thoroughly in volumes 2 and 3. Well, volumes 2 and 3 never really got there. In fact, after his death, Engels had to find the papers and transcribe them. The volume 3 he finally got published 1894. So over 25 years from the time of the initial publication. And it's interesting and sad. We're going to come in a minute in some of our critiques of it. Part of this is Marx was very unfortunate with his timing. Das Kapital is published in 1867. Well, it's fundamentally based on two things. It's fundamentally based on the labor theory of value, and it's fundamentally based on questions of distribution and can we just set whatever the return is to each part of the production process. What was about to take place in just a couple years totally overwhelmed Marx. The neoclassical revolution occurred. 2 books in 1871, Menger's Grundsatz, his Principles of Economics came out. Karl Menger, the great Austrian economist, father of that school, and the Englishman William Stanley Jevons came out with his work, and then likewise Leon Walras came out his work in 1873. And marginal economics is going to revolutionize and make his thinking, this foundational stuff that he's looking at, totally wrong at that. So very poor timing of that as well. But back to, I'll expand that in a moment, but back to Marx. In his way, this economic solution is always going to be creating the problem as we go. In each epoch, people are going to produce these economies are going to transform. New technologies are going to rise. By the way, he never says how. What is the process for these new technologies arising? But it's going to upset these prior social arrangements. That's going to create class conflict. Remember, because his history is one of class struggle, and that's going to lead to some new economic system. He defines what a class is. A class has to have some sort of common interest, common battle against another class. And if they don't have this common battle, they're going to be fighting amongst themselves, he says. So that's kind of Marx's view on the world. And for him, for socialism, there's a question. Marx never really defines what socialism is. In fact, Marx ridicules many of the utopian socialists of his day for even trying to explain what socialism was. Now, it's not that he didn't think that you could define what socialism was, but because of his dialectical style, you could only understand what socialism is by looking at its antithesis, capitalism, right? You'd have to see inherent in his critique of capitalism, you would see what he meant by socialism. But it requires you to go a little bit depth. It's not quite clear what he means. So at minimum, it allowed for much misunderstanding with what socialism could be based on his kind of definition. So he identifies capital in a kind of interesting way, not the way that we think of capital today. It's defined by its earning power. And so a property of producing profit or interest. He says it's a social relation of production, a claim on goods produced by others. And his quote, thus capital is not a thing, but a social relationship between persons established by the instrumentality of things. So it's like this. If I have a hammer, and I use that hammer in any capacity for building something in my shop, that hammer for Marx is not capital. However, if I hire you and I give you a hammer and maybe a saw, anything else, in your hands, in labor's hands, it becomes capital because it's going to yield a profit. If you use that same instrument just by ourselves, in any part of the proletariat using this equipment, it would not be capital. But in the hands of a capitalist, where it's going to earn a return, then it becomes capital for him. And so he says what's peculiar to capitalism is exploitation of the nominally free labor of others. So again, get that appearance versus essence. It appears as if there's a free exchange of labor for money. That's the appearance only. But the essence of it is not. There is no free exchange. The worker is forced to exchange his labor for money in the Marxian view. Okay, and I want you to notice the last bullet. Once you go down that path that Marx is suggesting, in essence, anytime you have anything beyond kind of self-production, when you get into the division of labor, where you hire out your service for others, necessarily we're talking exploitation in this. And so that's inherent when any time you get from beyond a rude society, really, for Marx. And so he thinks that's kind of bad. He says that's the negation of private property. So much of what we say in kind of modern welfare economics, we make much of the fact of mutual gains from trade, and any time you have a voluntary transaction, there's gains from trade to be had. Marx doesn't buy that. There's no such thing as voluntary transaction. You're forced because the essence of it. In appearance, it's voluntary. But in its essence, it's not for Marx. I'm going to give you just a little bit of technical. I'm not concerned. This will not be on your one little exam on to duplicate this, but I want you to see kind of where he's coming from here. See if you can follow this. So he followed Ricardo and Mill. He focused on distribution. Let's look at his system here. If labor is the source of value, where does interest, where does profit fit into this? So he calls the capitalists and the landlords exploiters of labor, because there is no role in the Marxist process for value, because all value is created by labor in this model. And so he has a formula he calls the rate of profit, or he also calls it the rate of exploitation. And that's P is equal to the surplus value divided by the final product. So I've got the little formula P is equal to S divided by R. And what the surplus value is it's the value of a product that is not given to labor. And he makes a big deal of, let's say that you work 8 hours a day, and it's not just the hours that he's talking about. It's the value of these hours for Marx. And let's say that to reproduce the room, the board, the cost that it would be to have you be able to do this all over again. In other words, you might work for 5 hours, in other words, of that 8, just to do your subsistence so you can survive. And because, kind of that subsistence pay, you're not paid those 3. Those 3 hours are above and beyond. That's surplus to what you need. That's not socially useful labor. It's exploitation. It's surplus value. It's what's sucked off from your labor by the capitalist, in his mind. Okay? And so then on the denominator, the R, this final product, it's a mixture of constant capital. So constant capital, it's the depreciation of factories and equipment. It's not just the value of capital itself, just the depreciation. How much is used up in this production process, right? Plus the socially useful labor. Back to our example, that would be like that 5 hours that's necessary to get you to be able to get up tomorrow and do it all over again. So in this model, machinery is going to actually lead to lower costs, it's going to tend to lead to a situation where larger and larger firms are going to be able to drive down costs. But when you do it, it's also going to lower the profits of a firm, and it's going to lead to kind of monopoly practices in the economy. So Marx noted that, hey, this doesn't mean workers will necessarily be worse off. He says you could even see real wages may remain the same. They may even rise, and yet relative wages may fall for Marx. And that's kind of where he'll be looking at why this doesn't work well. Another quote he's got here, if capital is growing rapidly, wages may rise. The profit of capital rises incomparably more rapidly. And here's the key part. The material position of the worker has improved. The workers get more goods or services, right? And he admits it. But at a cost of his social position. The social gulf that divides him from the capitalist has widened. Can you hear echoes, or our calls today that as a class billionaires should not exist? Is that not an echo of this thought that Marx had? There truly is nothing new under the sun, right? And it's interesting. He was truly a Ricardian. We talked about that earlier. But Ricardo would not have gone where Marx went. Here's a nice quote I was able to find from Ricardo. Because Ricardo would note that, labor's wages are high if they get more of that share. He starts off with that. He agrees with that. But to know his real condition, we must still inquire what this produce is in quantity. I should estimate his condition by the abundance of necessaries which those money wages would procure him. It's not enough for Ricardo for the worker to get a bigger share. The worker actually needs to get more stuff for his or her material position to improve. So Ricardo, while providing the framework with which Marx jumped off, would not have gone where Marx went. I think that's clear. Okay, another part of I just briefly want to touch on here for us is this idea of his view on money, which I think is actually a reasonable critique of capitalism, but I would say it's a reasonable critique of humanity overall, because so he talks about originally, in a barter economy, a commodity will exchange for a commodity. So you see there, C leads to C prime. You and I exchange something. I get one thing, I get another thing. That's kind of what the barter economy does. But then Marx introduces money, and so I might exchange a commodity to you, and you might give me money, and from that money I might buy something from you. So now there's something different. The essence of what's going on in Marx's world would have changed because of this introduction of money. And now it's really easy for the capitalist to focus on making money rather than making commodities. So the relationship very quickly will change to M going to C, leading to M prime, where we start with the capitalist starts with some money. They buy resources, make some products, sell them, so that at the end of the day, they have more money. And that's now, in his mind, the view of the capitalist. And this has changed the essence of what the economic system is all about. Even worse for this is kind of this end process in the financial system where money just leads to money, where you might have day trading leading to more money in the financial markets. And Marx is a critic of this process. There's something to it, when people love money. It's a risk. But it's certainly not true that even prior to modern capitalism that people weren't able to fall in love with money. That seems to be a rather age-old human problem. Nevertheless, it's something to be aware of. But it's certainly not just existing with capitalism. The power to do what he said is increased with capitalism, however. So with that, we're going to take some conclusions now of Marx's views and see what it compares with actual evidence. So for Marx, this transformation as businesses get more and more bigger and bigger, it's going to lead to monopoly power. And when they do that, the way they do that is to drive down costs, where they put small business as out of business. But that's also going to lower the rate of profit in his mind. But I will tell you that's how he's defined profit, which leads to that result. And when that happens, it leads to increased unemployment because, again, to drive down these costs, they're going to have to get more and more levels of technology and machinery that's going to put people out of work. So now we have a problem where we have underconsumption. People are out of work, so they can't buy the stuff that's produced by all these machines and technology. Well, that's going to lead to business cycles and depression. That's going to lead to the revolution as class conflict will arise between these have-nots who do not have jobs that are put out of work by this technology, and that's going to be the revolutionary result that leads to the onset of socialism. So that's kind of the way Marx views the world and the way this all plays out. Well, how does this work with the actual day? Just got a few charts to have you think about it. Monopoly, do we actually have monopoly? Well, maybe. You can make a case today that Apple's a monopoly of phones, but isn't there Samsung? There is, and there are other things. But here's the interesting thing. Take a look at these companies that were around, the biggest companies in 1917. Let's start comparing, and they're color-coded, so you might just glance even if you can't read it. And if you see the colors are a lot different over on the right, that's starting to tell you something. It's kind of different kind of firms. And we see that many of the largest firms 50 years later were not even really around much in the earlier time. But what about the transformation now? And look at all those big companies now, Apple, Alphabet, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook. They were never seen in the 60s. So whatever Marx thinks about monopoly, it's not a sustainable monopoly. There's still innovation inherent in the system. This rivalrous process, which he remarked on earlier, does not just lead inexorably to one big company at the top that's going to dominate. That view of monopoly is not true or representative of reality. How about lower profits? I was able to get like a 25-year or so snapshot easily on charts today, but that's not true. We look at profits don't tend to fall. They tend to be pro-cyclical. Profits tend to rise with in the boom times, and if we have a recession, they tend to go down, and that's been the history for long periods of time. But it's possible to make relatively constant rates of profit throughout. And if you break it down a little bit further, I took a snapshot from just some of the industries. It's not even a mature industry. So if we want to think of industrials as being a very mature industry, that one's also still going to be able to make a relatively high, steady rate of profits. They're not going to be falling. So it's not just, well, hey, the technology firms are making these great high profits, but everybody else is following the Marxian model. In other words, every industry is going against what Marx would say. So that didn't seem to work out. How about unemployment, the increasing unemployment? Well, here's an unemployment chart since the late 1940s, the best length of time of data that I could find from the Federal Reserve Board. And what do you see about unemployment? Well, it also is kind of counter-cyclical. It's not pro-cyclical in the sense that unemployment tends to fall as the business cycle expands. Have a recession, people get unemployed, a lot of unemployment, and then it goes again. So it just kind of runs counter to the actual business cycle. But there's no indication over long periods of time, unemployment is staying around that 5 to 10%. It's not rising according to the Marxian model. How about thinking about the markets as well? Look at how dynamic the economy has been. If you look at this employment history, this chart, you can see kind of the various areas where labor could go into over time. And obviously, back in 1850, pretty much everybody's in this green doing agriculture. And very few people are involved in agriculture today because of the tremendous productivity gains we've made in agriculture. But do they fit into this reserve army of industrial workers? No. They go do different things. Manufacturing expanded initially, and as manufacturing has contracted, so other areas of the economy have grown. So the economy really is quite dynamic, and that was not really captured in the Marxian model. How about underconsumption leading to depression? Here's a chart of real per capita consumption expenditures in the United States. And we just see a steady rise over time. People's consumption choices are able to rise as the economy has grown. So that aspect of Marxism has not borne out in U.S. today. And this is emblematic of any country that has really represented or accepted free markets. So this isn't just cherry-picking the data. So why did we have these falls? We have them for several reasons, but the labor theory of values is the biggest one. When Marx based his theory on a flawed premise, right? A couple of quotes that really help understand that. A coat is not worth 8 times as much as a hat to the community because it takes 8 times as long to make it. The community is willing to devote 8 times as long to the making of a coat because it will be worth 8 times as much to it. Or as another author says, pearls are not valuable because men die for them. Men die for them because they are valuable. He was getting the cart before the horse in this labor theory of value. And the overall marginal revolution that I referred to earlier, that really did transform things, because what we found is that value is not based on the labor that goes into it. Value is determined by the incremental or marginal utility gain by the consumption of an additional unit of a good. That's why water would be valued so low. That first drink of water in a desert, you'd pay $1 million for it. But when water is so plentiful, the increment of that last unit of water you consume, it's just tap water. Who cares? I've already bathed. I've already drank all I want. I don't need it. I might use it to wash my car or whatever, right? It's that low value you have. That kind of drove thing. And further, that even relates to this marginal revolution also helped us understand distribution. That we found out that actually each input to the joint production process was such that each input would be paid its contribution to the overall product. So it would receive its marginal product. That was John Bates Clark showed that in 1899. So Marx had the misfortune, as I said, of building his foundational ideas on 2 false premises that would quickly go away. So it's a foundation of sand. I couldn't help but throw in a Bible verse, not talking about Marxian economics, but let's face it, if you put your foundation on sand, it's not going to do very well. And Marx had a magnificent edifice, right? It's a fantastic, elaborate kind of economic system, but it was based on a foundation of sand. It was not going to be able to last. And that should not be surprising that any individual should think that they could design something better than millions of people in their mutual interactions and different societies over long periods of time have been able to produce in what would emerge from social cooperation. So he also had a problem, what we call the transformation problem. In Marx's model, capital-intensive industries should be less profitable, but that's not true. He also failed to understand the reward that the capitalist should get and the entrepreneur should get. Because Bobovrik in The Marginal Revolution identified this. In fact, interest is a reward for waiting. Because when you put your money up to be worked into the production process, you have to forego consumption. There's a reward for interest, and that should be paid. Also, workers are paid in advance of sales. And not only that, they're paid in advance of potential sales that may not take place. And so that also requires a reward because those sales may never come. They get to eat first before there's anything even produced. So there has to be a reward for that, for the capitalist in the process. And so in conclusion, we would say that there's not a single thing of the Marxian system that remains as part of the core understanding in economics today. Had some good insights, but they can't survive his theoretical apparatus.